On this episode of Backin' Boys, I'm going to go over what I would recommend for a rod, reel, and line setup for fishing some of the big lakes here in BC. Watch this video if you're thinking about buying a setup. If you already have a setup, watch the video, comment down below with what you would suggest and why, and people can form their own opinion. Alright, let's go.
Oh shit!
John, how do you feel, bud?
I feel so happy. We got it! That's sweet! You got 20 pounds.
I don't know if this net's big enough, man. Oh, for sure. Oh, no!
Yeah!
Yeah! Holy shit!
Oh!
Please get him.
Yeah! Oh my god!
It's that time of year where we're just transitioning from our ice fishing season into open water season. So we're kind of in that limbo between the two. I'm itching to get out, got some time to kill. I had someone on our Instagram page ask me what I would or what I use for the big lakes around here. So it kind of inspired me to make this video. This is something that I've kind of come up with over the last couple of years. I think I've got it pretty dialed. It works really well, so I'm going to go over the items I use, why I use them, and kind of some other options and why I chose to not go with those. If you're thinking about getting into some of the big lake fishing, and the big lakes, we'll classify them as lakes that you kind of got to go back to multiple days to be able to cover the lake. So the ones that are close to me, Skaha, Okanagan, Mabel, Shuswap, Little Shuswap, those are all within kind of that hour-and-a-half drive from my place. So those are the ones I mainly fish, but this should apply to kind of any of the other big lakes. Anytime you're trolling for some of the, we'll call them bigger fish, when you got to cover ground, find the fish, and there's just a lot of area to cover. All the things I'm going to talk about, this is just my opinion. They might not be the right way, they might not be the best. It's just what I've kind of gathered together and what I like using. First thing I'll start with is reels. Any of you guys that are fly fishermen, you know that using a one-to-one fly style reel or mooching reel adds a whole other element to fighting fish. Catching fish is awesome, but doing it on a one-to-one reel adds a whole nother aspect to catching those big fish. The other reasons why they're such a joy to own is they are unbelievably simple, easy to maintain, and other than driving over top of it with a truck, it's going to last you a lifetime. If you're a fly guy starting out, very simple way to get out on the big water, trolling, kind of bucktails, anything like that. Grab one of your old spools, slap a bunch of mono on it, and get out there. This is the exact reel and line setup I used on our Kalamalka lake trout video. If you haven't watched that, go check it out. This caught me a 12-pound lake trout. It's just an old, cheap fly reel that I spooled up with mono and clipped onto a hand-crank downrigger. And that was enough to get me into my first lake trout. So it can be as simple as this, but what I use every time I go out there is this guy right here. This reel, it's Daiwa M1. It's just their kind of cheap, affordable mooching reel. It's got a one-way drag on it. Some of the older reels, like this old Windex reel that I picked up for $5 at a flea market, it does not have a one-way drag, so it means whatever your drag is set at, you're fighting the drag as you're twisting the fish in. These reels you can pick up used for extremely cheap. Even brand new, they're very affordable. On the Cabela's website, the Daiwa M1, it's full pop, 120 bucks Canadian. The Shimano equivalent, 140 bucks. So those are not on sale. Very affordable pickup for a new reel. I do prefer these. I have one of the Shimanos and the Daiwa. I fished with a buddy with Islanders. Extremely nice reels. They are they're very expensive. Their drags are almost too good. If you're using them on a downrigger, line creep seems to be an issue, and it seems to be a very common issue. It's not necessarily a problem with the drag. I truly believe it's just their drag is too smooth, if you can have a drag that's too smooth. So on these older reels, kind of the initial brake to get it going will be a bit higher torque than what it is once the line's moving. So when it's in a downrigger, it'll hold itself. As soon as it gets a pull, it'll start going, and you catch your fish. The Islanders, they're a consistent torque to get it to turn, whether it's stopped or already moving. So as the reel sits in the downrigger, you'll watch them slowly unravel. So to solve that, you have to crank the drag down, and if you do get a big fish that pops out of a downrigger clip, well, you got that drag absolutely cranked down. It can cause you all sorts of issues. So I do prefer using some of the cheaper reels compared to the Islander. My buddy did say that on their newer versions they might have solved that, so I'm not quite sure if the new ones are any better than some of the older ones. For the price difference, I couldn't justify spending that much on a reel that you're going to have some issues with. So I like using these older mooching reels. They work very well. Easily obtainable. You can find them. I got this one I think for $20 from a flea market. So they're out there. If you're got a bit of a budget, if you search around, you can find yourself something that's super affordable. Next, I'm going to talk about line. This is where I have tried quite a few different line setups, and as far as I can find, the way I run mine, it's not very common. I'm sure there's people out there doing the same thing, but kind of a typical mooching reel line setup is a decent strength mono that has maybe some braid backing just for extra capacity. Like the salmon guys will usually have backing, a braid backing onto a whole lot of mono, and then they go onto their gear. Coming from a fly fishing background, anybody who's ever caught a fish on a fly rod, there's a certain feel to it. I chalk that up to the fact that there's no line stretch. If you're using a mono, it always has some sort of line stretch, and quite a bit of it. On this spool right here, I believe, this is a 12-pound mono, and over the span of only a couple feet, when I'm pulling on it to what I feel like is getting, maybe 5 or 6 pounds of force, there's like 2 inches of stretch just doing this. So when you factor in that there's maybe an inch of stretch per foot of line, if you have a couple 100 feet of line out, that is a lot of stretch. Not a bad thing. It acts as a giant shock absorber, so when a fish is thrashing around, it can essentially soak up the slack that a fish might create by throwing its head back toward you. So it does serve a function that could save you from losing a couple of fish. The one thing it does do with the stretch, that same dampening effect that could possibly help you in certain situations, it takes a lot of the feel. You don't feel as connected to the fish. Where on fly line, there might be a measurable small amount of stretch to some of the fly line, but when you pull on it, it's not going anywhere. Same with braid. Braid has absolutely no stretch to it. It's just a rope, more or less, that does not have any give. So on my setup, I spool it entirely with braid. This reel right here, I believe, has 25-pound braid on it. And then I put about a 20-foot fluoro leader tied to the braid. So what this does is when you're out there fighting a fish, you are connected to that fish. You feel every turn, every head thrash, very similar to catching a fish on a fly rod. You seem to be able to feel the fish, kind of get a sense for what it's doing, where when you got a fish that's a couple 100 feet away on mono, it takes a lot of the fun away from it for me. So I like to spool mine up with braid. The one advantage with braid is you can put an absolute crazy amount of line on these reels. So if you're out bucktailing, want to get really far back, and do hook into something that takes you for a big long run, you never really have to worry about getting spooled when you've got one of these big mooching reels spooled with braid. I believe at 25 pounds of braid spooled up on these mooching reels, I think I have over 500 meters on that one reel. So that's never a worry, getting spooled. The one disadvantage is, like I said, how the mono could save you in certain situations with the stretch. When you're running braid, you do not have that give. So you can get into a situation where if you have a fish that's thrashing extremely violently, the shock load on your leader is a lot more than if you were running just a whole bunch of mono. So to deal with that problem, I make up for the lack of stretch in the braid with using a soft rod. Where the mono would have that stretch to kind of act as a shock absorber, I make up for the lack of stretch in the braid with an extremely soft rod. How I connect my, we'll call it a shock leader, I'll get into leader stuff after this, but how I connect my 20-pound fluoro to the braid is using an FG knot. There's a lot of videos out there of guys showing you how to tie this, so I won't go over that. It's very popular in the saltwater world for connecting braid to fluoro. So there's quite a bit of information on it. The reason why I use this knot is that it is an extremely low profile knot. So running through the guides, you never have to worry about it getting hung up on something. It is very, very strong. It's a great way for connecting a decent sized fluoro to braid. Check out some videos on YouTube if you want to look more into this knot. Whatever you feel comfortable with, if you want to run this setup, use whatever knot you feel like will work for you, but highly recommend the FG knot. As far as leaders, so like I said, I run about 20 feet of 20-pound fluoro off of the braid, and then depending on what I'm using, I will run another leader off of a swivel to my presentation. So say if I'm bucktailing, I have this 20-pound fluoro already on, but what I will do is tie a piece of, say, like 13-pound from the swivel to the bucktail. It adds that little bit of smaller diameter line, so it's not quite as visible. But if I'm, say, connecting up to a flasher, dodger, anything like that, then I can just run this swivel directly onto that, have your other leader after that. So I very rarely ever just connect a lure directly onto this fluoro that's spooled up on the reel. Plugs are about the only thing that I'll run directly off this line. Anything else, it's either connecting to a piece of hardware which has a leader after it, or bucktailing, stuff like that. I will just build my own leader. Leader strength. On some of these big lakes, I would never recommend using anything lighter than, we'll say, 10. Kind of a rule of thumb I use is whatever lake you're fishing, whatever the weight of fish you think you could possibly catch in that lake, not the unicorns kind of thing, but something where you have a legitimate chance, use that weight leader. So a lot of these big lakes, hooking into a 10-pound fish isn't unheard of. You know, it happens. A lot of anglers on these big lakes catch into fish that size every year. So that's kind of what I use as a rule of thumb. Anytime you're even fishing for some of the smaller fish, like kokanee fishing on Kalamelka Lake, last year I had something grab onto my little pink hoochie and just take off with it. I don't know if it was a big rainbow or could have possibly been a lake trout, but that's the beauty of fishing these big lakes, is there's big fish in there. So as long as you got a hook in the water, you have a chance. So I would not recommend using anything lighter than 10 pounds on these local big lakes. You might have days and days of catching kind of 2-3 pound fish or even smaller, and it might feel like those big ones aren't there, but they are. And the worst thing that can happen is hooking into one of those bigger fish and losing it because your leader breaks. Losing gear sucks. You're essentially littering in a way, so that sucks. And mostly having that fish maybe have a bucktail stuck in it for a while can't be fun. So use a decent sized leader. I'd rather have the possibility of maybe not hooking up as much because they're scared of a leader than snapping stuff off. So big lakes, big leaders, show up prepared to catch big fish. The rods I like to use, if you're a fly guy, feel like the equivalent of like a 6-weight fly rod. So something fairly soft for the type of fish you might be targeting, but I've never been worried about a rod being my limiting factor on a big fish. I'm always worried about, leader, strength, knot strength, stuff like that. So going on the softer side of rods, some might argue that you'd have the possibility of breaking a rod, but that's never seemed to have been an issue. The one thing with soft rods on downriggers is when you see like a lot of the ocean fishing videos, when they get the bite, doesn't pop the clip, guys will come and just hammer that rod to try to break it off the clip. That I could see someone breaking a softer rod doing that. What I found way more effective than using the rod to try to pop a downrigger clip if the fish doesn't do it by itself is just reel down. Essentially use that mooching reel like a winch and just reel down, even have your rod tip down in the water as if you're trying to lift the downrigger ball up just by the action of tightening up your line. You'll feel it pop off, and then you can lift your rod, take up all the slack. Way easier on the fishing rod, and I believe it's way more effective of making up that slack that a downrigger can create. So where you have to reel a few times before you make a solid connection to the fish after popping off a downrigger clip. I find that just reeling down, letting the rod dip into the water and popping it off that way, you're able to catch up to that fish far faster than popping it with the rod. When it pops, the rod's already up in the air, so then you're chasing it with the reel rather than using the length of the rod to pick up the slack. Rod length, all dependent on what boat you're fishing out of and if you're fishing with other people. If you're fishing out of a small boat by yourself, get a shorter rod. It makes landing the fish a hell of a lot easier. If you're on a bigger boat or with multiple people, so you have someone that can net a fish, going with those long rods can help with acting like that shock absorber. But if you've ever tried to land a fish by yourself with a 10.5-foot rod, especially a bigger fish, it can get really tricky. So rod length, if you're on a smaller boat or by yourself, use a smaller rod. If you're with people on a bigger boat, you can choose whatever feels right for you. This exact setup I've used from just clipping on a little dodger and a hoochie for kokanee fishing. I clipped on an 11-inch flasher to go salmon fishing on little shuswap. It's a pretty good all-around setup. You don't have to always be catching big fish. It'll work with whatever you want to go after in these big lakes. You can make this work. If you're not using a downrigger, that 20-pound fluoro kind of shock leader, great place to be able to clip on like your weights and stuff like that to get it down deeper in the summer months. Essentially, the least amount of gear you can keep on your line while fighting a fish is very enjoyable, but if you got to use a dipsy diver or something in the summer months to get down, those are all great options. Catching a fish with a dipsy diver on is better than not catching any fish at all because you can't get down deeper. Hopefully this helps you guys out decide which route you want to go. If you have any questions or any ideas that you'd like to add, like I said, comment down below, and people can watch this video, read the comments, and kind of pick and choose what seems to work best for them, and they can go from there.